Appalachian Harvest is a food hub located in Southwest Virginia that provides regional herb and vegetable farmers with training, technical support, aggregation, and distribution services, connecting them to retail markets. We currently source produce from farmers in Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This webinar is made possible by Risk Management Agency 2018 Risk Management Education Partnership Program.
Tonight, since we have three related but also separate topics, I kind of present how we're going to do this. I thought we'd begin with maybe a brief overview of just produce food safety. What is the big picture looking like? Then we'll talk about good agricultural practices and what that means in relationship to produce farmers. And then we'll take a look at the Produce Safety Rule portion of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And lastly, we'll do a review, kind of compare and contrast, and then actually look at some resources that are available out there for producers. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. So why are we worried about produce food safety, or what are we worried about? When we say produce food safety, it is kind of a very broad term. And what we're primarily focusing on are microorganisms that cause human health issues or foodborne illness. We can have things such as contamination from broken glass or hydraulic fluid or anything like that, but the main focus of our efforts when it comes to produce food safety is looking at those microorganisms of human health concern. So there may be the basic question of why does produce serve as a source of pathogens? And there's several reasons, and I would say even the ones we're going to present tonight is an exhaustive list of those. But one of the very foundational things about produce and those human pathogens is that they occur in the same environment. So since produce is growing in an environment where those human pathogens can survive, then we're going to have at times them existing together. And so if we had an environment where none of those pathogens could exist, we also would have an environment that does not allow us to grow produce. So we do have to understand there is always that potential risk because they are growing in the same environment. Secondly, just in the normal course of activities on the farm, whether we're talking about in the field, post-harvest, or even distribution activities, produce can unknowingly become contaminated. I do want to stress unknowingly because when we talk about produce food safety, we talk about contamination. It's not merely as simple as produce looks clean or something appears to be clean. We're dealing with microorganisms, so contamination is not something we can witness or verify just by looking at things. And so it's not readily apparent when this happens. And because of that, we never know if it happens. And that's why we have to take preventative steps. And overarching, one of the most difficult aspects of produce is how often it's eaten raw. Whenever it comes to cooking, we have a kill step there. And so when we have a kill step, we have the ability to control that pathogen, kill that pathogen, and protect human health. But without a kill step, and again, much of our produce that is sold is eaten fresh and raw, then we don't have a kill step. So those are just some of the reasons why we do look to produce to be a source of pathogens, or why it's potentially a source. And we try to control those aspects as much as possible. What about where are these pathogens coming from? One of the most common sources is fecal matter. And probably the first thing that may spring to your mind is actually animal fecal matter. So wildlife, we think of, in the past years, spinach that was related, possibly a spinach outbreak, E. coli that was related to wild boars getting into production areas or water sources. We may consider, domestic animals on the farm, whether we're talking about pets or livestock. Those can also be sources. Human sources, though, of fecal matter may not be the first that come to mind. So we can experience that if we have failed sanitary systems. So if we're talking about a municipal or even a farm septic system that is failing and is allowing untreated waste to enter into surface waters or something like that. It could be as simple as a porta potty that when it's being serviced is somehow leaking or otherwise not functioning correctly, and so it's providing a source of contamination to the environment. Another thing is just people not properly washing their hands. So if we have workers on the farm, are they following proper hygiene procedures, washing their hands correctly, so we don't get any contact between fecal matter and then the produce they may be harvesting. It's important to keep in mind that a lot of the pathogens that we're concerned with are specifically adapted to living and growing inside the digestive systems of warm-blooded animals. And so that does include humans as well as most pets and most livestock. So it is important to recognize that and understand why fecal matter is such a concern to us. Another common source would be contaminated water. It can be a contaminant itself, whereby like if we're pulling water from a creek or a surface body like a lake, that the water itself contains one of these pathogens, or it could be just the means by the pathogen moves on the farm. So it can actually move it. So things like runoff from an adjacent field is something that may not first come to mind, but if you have, for instance, livestock grazing in the field next door, there's a heavy rain event and rain washes runoff into your production area, you may have introduced a contaminant. Another thing, of course, is something like spraying, where we're taking water and any number of pest control materials or perhaps fertility materials and applying those directly to the product or the growing plant. We have a direct interaction there. So we always have to make sure that the water we're using for those purposes is not a concern to us. And lastly, contaminated surfaces. So if we think about all the host of different surfaces that produce would contact as we're going from the field to the final consumer, so whether it's field equipment, any sort of post-harvest equipment such as sorting tables, washing lines, things of that nature, could be harvest containers, even the final container we're putting it into. Any of those surfaces, if they were to become contaminated, could themselves be a source of pathogens. And so that's why we take specific steps related to sanitation and things of that nature to break any sort of cycle there that might possibly occur. So those are some possible sources of pathogens. There are others that may be more specific to one operation or another. Some of the pathogens we're most concerned with, and again, this would not be an exhaustive list, but E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, just right now in the news, if you've gone to the store and tried to buy romaine lettuce, you probably did not see any on the shelf. Romaine lettuce from California right now is recommended not to be purchased. It's not being shipped because they fear that it is the source of an outbreak related to, if I remember correctly, E. coli. So this is something that is currently happening now. Viruses are also a concern. Norovirus is one of the most common produce foodborne illnesses that you see happening in the landscape, but also hepatitis, specifically right now, Hepatitis A in Kentucky. They have a number of different outbreaks related to restaurant workers who were infected with Hepatitis A and were unaware. And so that's causing a public health concern in that state. And lastly, parasites. And parasites are not something that's as commonly seen with contaminated produce, but it does occur. So things like Giardia or Cryptosporidium, both as parasites, can also be a foodborne illness related to produce. Typically, both of those, we're seeing water as being the source of that contaminant. So again, those are just some common ones you may have heard in the news recently in some cases, and just have a better understanding of what some of the focus is when we're talking about those pathogens. So, to me, I think when I always want to talk to an ag group about produce food safety, it's one of those questions I think you have to answer is this really a concern? Is this something that an individual farmer on their operation should take time to be worried about? If you start looking at the numbers, I think it becomes evident what that answer is. CDC estimates that 48 million people in the U.S. get sick every year from foodborne illness. I'll stress that these numbers are not directly produce related illnesses. This is just all foodborne illness. Out of that, 128,000 are hospitalized and 3,000 die from foodborne illness. So there was a quote I saw from the FDA where they say, this represents a significant public health burden that is largely preventable. So I do think, especially looking at those numbers and looking at the statement from FDA, that there is a valid reason to be concerned. But concern does not necessarily need to be that we're scared. The U.S. overall has a very good track record when it comes to food safety in general, and even specifically produce food safety. So it's not that we have a system that's broken, but it is a concern because when things do go wrong within that system, oftentimes the result can be loss of life. And of course, any producer would want to avoid that. So it is something that we do have to take seriously, but it's not at a point that we have a failure of a system. So that's important to note too. Most farmers, over the years I've been working with this, they make minor changes to their operation. More often than not, they're doing things well already. So what we look at whenever we're looking at both good agricultural practices and the Food Safety Modernization Act is addressing those concerns that are real with the goal of reducing produce-related foodborne illness. So that's why we have GAP out there, and that's even why FSMA exists. It's because there is concern, and there are things that we can do as producers that allow us to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. So jumping right into what is GAP. GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practices. I've always felt like GAP was a horrible term to name it, simply because it's so broad. But generally when you hear GAP in relationship to produce, it is looking at the best practices to reduce the likelihood of produce-related foodborne illness for growers. So it is specifically looking at that pathogen-based foodborne illness. I'll also mention that hand in hand with GAP is GIP, or Good Handling Practices. So Appalachian Harvest as a food hub, we tell everyone that we're GAP certified. If we want to be more technically correct, we're actually GIP, or Good Handling Practices certified, because it's related to the distribution activities involved with produce. And so they go hand in hand. Sometimes a farm is in a situation where they're looking at both GAP and GIP. In reality, other than just a little bit of terminology difference, they go hand in hand. So there's not a big difference, but just so you're aware of that, you may sometimes run across GHP instead of GAP, and that's what GHP stands for. GAP itself and GIP came from an FDA guidance document in 1998. So the basis of it's been around for a while. And for those of you who aren't familiar with federal regulations, a guidance document is not anything that's mandatory. It's not legally binding. It's not law. It's just, as it says, guidance for an industry on what they should be looking towards, things they should be doing. So GAP is based on that document from 1998. And if you look at the various aspects or topics that it covers, things such as soil, previous land use, water source and uses, manure and municipal biosolids, worker health and hygiene, sanitary facilities, field sanitation and harvest practices, packing house sanitation and practices, transportation, traceback, and recalls. So all those different aspects come together under GAP and look at the full system. And if you just take a moment and glance at those, you do see you go all the way from the field through sales and distribution. So GAP does look at every aspect of the system, but not all aspects would apply to you. For instance, you may not be in the distribution of your product. So just be aware that some aspects do or do not apply given on the specifics of the operation. There is kind of a basic process for GAP on the farm. First, the farm basically reviews what they're doing, what's happening, what's the situation, boots on the ground. And what that does, that allows you to identify where sources of microbes and maybe other concerns, because while we don't focus on things such as having lights in the packing area and those bulbs could break, while that's not a focus of GAP, that actually does come into play in most GAP evaluations because it is a concern. But again, we look mainly at the sources of microbes. You begin to understand on your farm, on your operation, how those microbes could move or what vectors might exist on your farm. And that will differ from operation to operation. You implement practices that are going to prevent that movement, and you actually plan those out. And you plan corrective actions to address those concerns that you identify. And lastly, you monitor and document those actions, and you have records related to it. And what this ultimately creates for you is a farm GAP manual, or a farm food safety manual, or a farm action plan. You'll hear it referred to by any number of different names, but what it is, it's a written document that addresses the different aspects of food safety on your farm, and it's specific to your farm. There's a lot of different resources out there to help you create one, but it has to be specific to your farm to be valuable. So what we find is for most growers, they experience GAP when they look towards the wholesale market. Generally speaking, what you find is at the wholesale market, your buyer will start talking about you need a GAP certificate or you need to be GAP certified before they'll purchase from you. And what they're talking about we'll mention here in a minute. Other times you'll see where only maybe a GAP training of a farmer is required. So that's sometimes the first issuance that they see the notice of GAP. But typically that's the beginning stages. And I actually have a poll I would like to go ahead and launch right now. Let me launch that now. It's a couple of questions. If you would go ahead and answer that. That'll just give me the opportunity to see some of where the audience is at. And then that way, as we move forward, I can adjust some of what I'm saying maybe directly to that. So we'll give everybody a couple more seconds to go ahead and interact with that poll. Okay. All right. Thank you. And actually, there we are. Let me do something else. Actually, I just realized when I launched that poll, it launched the wrong poll for me. So I had to go back in and switch that. So you should actually now see the correct poll up there instead of last week's. There's actually 3 questions on this poll. The first being, have you previously completed GAP or GAP certification training? The second being, have you previously completed a Food Safety Alliance FSMA grower training? And are you currently GAP certified by a third-party auditor? So I apologize for that technical error there, but I'm glad I caught it. Okay, give everybody just a couple seconds longer. Okay. Excellent. Thank you all. So we have a mix. We do have some who have been through GAP or GAP certification trainings. We do have some that have been through the FSMA grower training, which we'll talk more about that later. And we actually do have some that are certified currently by a third-party auditor for GAP. So that's good. It's good to see a diversity in the audience because I think there's some information that's going to be good for everybody throughout this. So some of you have definitely heard about GAP certificates and what that is, and so we'll be able to contrast the GAP side of things with FSMA. So the one big takeaway I want everybody to remember about GAP is it's voluntary. There's no regulatory requirement or enforcement involved with it. And basically the way I think of GAP is it's about market access. The way we see GAP, again, most of the time as a buyer requires a GAP certification of an operation. Therefore, it's only a decision, do I want to sell through this market or not? So it's about market access. GAP certification is specifically a third-party certification. And a third-party certification is where an entity or individual who is not directly involved in a transaction. So for instance, if I'm buying your tomatoes from you and it's my job to certify whether or not you're doing a good job with GAP, I may be tempted to fudge on something if I really need your product. So that's why we have a third-party entity come in, because regardless of whether they need the product or not, they don't need it, they're independent from the process, and so you get that fair and independent decision being made in the evaluation. So that third-party certification comes in, they verify that you have a GAP plan in place, and they verify that you're actually following it. So it's not just you have a written plan, you have a written plan and you are actually following those elements in your operation. The basic process for GAP certifications, if you were part of the organic certification or you're familiar with organic certification, you'll understand pretty much they're very similar. You select a GAP certifier. You do want to talk to your buyer or buyers as to what they find acceptable, because there's any number of different options out there. USDA is one certifier that a lot of operations will begin with. But even USDA has multiple different levels to GAP. So some of them are more involved than others. There's also private certifiers that have specific standards that some buyers require rather than others. So you really need to figure out which GAP certificate your buyer's looking for, because you don't want to prepare and complete a USDA GAP program only to find out that you needed one that was GFSI benchmark or standard. So there's a lot of options out there, and you need to find out what's specifically needed for your operation. And The only people that can help you determine that is your buyer. So after you determine which GAP program you're going to be focusing on, you actually create a GAP farm manual. Some of those are, some of the certifiers actually have an online system where you go through electronically and build a manual. So basically they ask you questions, you put in your responses, so it's very interactive. There's any other number of templates out there that work well. All of them will need to be tweaked to match what's happening on your farm. Appalachian Harvest actually has a training program that we put our growers through where we work with them in a day-long training. So they take a template and learn how to adapt it for their farm. And that way they can be prepared for that audit. Once the manual is complete, basically it's the job of the farm to go ahead and implement all those practices. A big one that is, especially when you're starting out, a big portion of it, making sure your workers have the training to implement those practices. So it's all well and good to come up with this great manual, but if you don't actually have boots on the ground following it, it doesn't work well for you. Certainly you're not going to pass an inspection. So then you schedule that inspection. You will sometimes hear these referred to as audits. I normally say inspection, but I may at times say audit, so I use those two interchangeably. Ordinarily, most GAP certifiers would want 2 to 3 months lead notice before they come out to your farm. So depending on exactly what scope you're auditing to, you may have to be in actual harvest practices, actually be harvesting a crop before they can come out and do the certification. For some standards, it's more of a general farm review, and in those cases, you may be able to have your audit completed without having harvest actually occurring. So again, it depends what exactly you're getting certified, exactly which standard, when that audit would happen for you, but very often they do need to see you actually doing the things such as harvest practices to verify those. So just be aware, 2 to 3 months lead time before you want that certificate in place. Often at the wholesale level, buyers can move your product prior to receiving that certificate, provided you actually have scheduled your GAP inspection. So there is sometimes some lag when you get availability of inspectors, and generally speaking, the industry recognizes that. So if you're making good faith efforts, oftentimes you have a little bit of leeway to work with your buyer on that, and won't necessarily impact your ability to sell through them. But again, check with your buyer. So once you go through that inspection and you pass it, what you ultimately receive is a GAP certificate. And I will mention that GAP certification is an annual process. So it's something that you go through each year to satisfy those buyer requirements. But typically after the first year, it's only minimal adjustments made on the farm, because once you have a basic plan in place, unless you're changing aspects of your production, you're going to see that the GAP plan remains fairly similar year to year. I will mention as we go through tonight that if you have any questions, you've got 2 options to bring those to my attention. One would be the chat option. The other would be question and answer. If you move the mouse on your screen, you'll actually see them pop out at the bottom, kind of in the center of the screen. I believe chat's on the left, question and answer is on the right. So if you have any questions as we go through, go ahead and feel free to use either one of those options to let me see those. I will try to pay attention to those as we're going through. If I happen not to see it, if I miss it, I'll definitely circle back around at the end and make sure we answer anything that hasn't been answered. So do make sure if you have questions to ask those as we go along, and we'll make certain to get those answered before we're finished tonight. So just as an example of what an audit verification or inspection checklist looks like, these are all the topics that can be covered by USDA GAP and GIP audit. You'll notice that while there's 7 parts up there, part 5 is absent. That's not an error on my part. Once upon a time, part 5 was a standalone section specifically for traceability. They've now removed it as a standalone section and have incorporated traceability in every other section. So that's why you'll see parts 1 through 7, but no part 5. And I will mention that for USDA GAP, the minimum that an operation can do is the general questions section and any other one section. So oftentimes when we're working with our farmers, and what we prefer our new folks move towards is to start with the general questions in the Part 1 farm review. Farm review covers a lot of different topics, so it's a good overall assessment of their farm. And then as they have completed that, either the second year or in future years, we encourage them to go ahead and look at the field harvest and field packing activities. Again, some of these sections might never apply to actual farm, such as Part 6 and Part 7, but those are available to farms that may qualify for those. So, in closing, and the thing I want to stress, because this is going to be a big difference between GAP and FSMA that we're getting ready to talk about. GAP certification is a voluntary choice. You don't have to worry if you don't want to do it, if you don't want to go to that market, not an issue. It's perfectly your choice to do that, and there's no requirement other than one that a buyer may establish. But I will stress, and this is something I always encourage growers to do, you should still be implementing those best practices that GAP would evaluate you on, because these are best practices that are intended to reduce the likelihood of foodborne illness. And obviously, you know, as an individual, no one wants to make someone else sick, but even from a business sense, if your farm is linked to some sort of foodborne illness, chances are you're not going to be in business in the future. It's just the reality of it. Buyers aren't going to want to buy from you. And, you know, quite honestly, you may be looking at being sued or other things that might occur. So really, to ignore the best practices is never a good plan. So I always encourage growers to take a look at what are the best practices for their operation, and even going into that next step of actually creating a manual. Even if you're not going to be evaluated on it, if you have a system in place, I always think that if it's written, it's something that you're trying to follow, you're going to follow through more often than not. So I always encourage growers, even if they may not be quite to the point of getting certification done, go ahead and implement those practices and create that manual so you can have a plan for your farm. So with GAP behind us, what about FSMA? And actually, I just see a typo on that screen. It should be FSMA. But FSMA stands for the Food Safety Modernization Act. Actually, within FSMA itself, there's 7 different rules. The one we're going to be focusing on is the Produce Safety Rule, or at least that's what we commonly call it. If you actually look at the more technical language from the regulations itself, it's the standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. So I think definitely using the moniker Produce Safety Rule is a lot shorter and easier and gets us to the same end result. So FSMA is federal law that was signed into law in 2011, so it's not something that just happened, but it's taken years to get the basic regulations associated with it implemented. FSMA was important because it gave new powers to the FDA, such as, you know, the ability to require a food recall. Previously, if the FDA wanted to require a food recall in a situation, they would have had to gone to court. They didn't have the power just to expressly do that. Other things they can do now is remove an exempt status that has something to do with the Produce Safety Rule, which we're getting ready to dive into. And so basically, it was a significant overhaul of how the FDA approached food safety in the U.S. And specifically, the Produce Safety Rule established for the first time science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables grown for human consumption. So again, we see common with GAP that the Produce Food Safety Rule looks at all aspects from the farm through distribution to the consumer. FSMA is a regulation, and because of that, it's not voluntary. Again, like one produce auction manager I know, he always says FSMA is like a stop sign. You don't have the option, or I guess I could say you do have the option of ignoring that stop sign, but it comes with penalties. So it is not an option. It is not voluntary. But, and there's a very big however here, not all produce crops and not all producers are subject to the FSMA Produce Safety Rule requirements. So there are carve-outs that would allow an operation not to be having to meet any of these standards technically. So we'll talk about these carve-outs, these exceptions. The first thing is to talk about what crops are not exempt. What crops are exempt from FSMA. What FSMA does is basically it goes back to that kill step process. And they examined and said what produce products typically are eaten or rarely eaten as raw, or they're typically cooked. So you can see on your screen a number of different products. It ranges from things like asparagus all the way to water chestnuts. I've highlighted a number of those that I think of as common produce items that people may be growing. And you'll notice a lot of those, for instance, potatoes. I don't know of anyone that eats potatoes raw normally, and certainly any number of those others on the screen are self-evident. I will say that these lists are exhaustive. What I mean by that is, like, for instance, we can see black beans, great northern beans, kidney beans, navy beans, pinto beans. We might lump all those together as dry beans because that's what they are. The problem is, let's say you're growing an heirloom cranberry bean. Because cranberry beans are not specifically listed on this list, they would still be subject to the regulation. This is written not as a general guideline currently, but as the specific products and only those produce items listed in it. And so that's caused some concern for producers in that clearly there's a trend there, for instance, with dry beans. But as it's written now, we could not say that a cranberry bean would meet this category and not be covered by FSMA. So you'll note there's a number of different products there that we do commonly grow in produce within our region that would be exempt from FSMA. It can be complicated in that if these are not the only products you're growing, so if you're growing other products as well, you still might actually fall under the authority of FSMA, and so we can talk about that a little bit. Also make a quick mention, food grains, things of that nature are not part of FSMA. They're not considered produce in the same way, so food grains are not something that is covered by FSMA. The other scenarios where we have crops that are not covered is, one, if they're not for sale. So if we're talking about produce that is used for personal consumption or on-farm consumption, it's not being sold, it's not subject to any FSMA rules. Pretty straightforward. FSMA is about sales. So we'll see that come into play here in a minute when we talk a little bit more about some further carve-outs within the regulations. And another specific exemption is when produce is receiving processing that adequately reduces the presence of microorganisms of public health concern. Essentially, when it's going through a kill step. So that would be things such as canning. So if you're growing tomatoes or green beans or something that's going to a cannery, that crop would not necessarily fall under FSMA because those crops are going through a kill step. So again, we have a food safety kind of safety net there with those, and that's why those aren't directly covered. So that kind of gives us the scenarios of what crops are not covered. Crops that are rarely eaten raw, but they have to be specifically listed. Crops that aren't for sale, that we're only consuming on the farm, as well as crops that are going through a kill step. So other crops, and you'll notice absent from that list a number of different produce that we grow, would all be covered by FSMA. But what about the producer side of it? Because I said there's both crops not covered as well as producers. Well, with producers, we've got a couple of different possibilities here. First and foremost, if you're familiar with a lot of federal regulations, there are generally carve-outs related to exempting or lowering the impact on very small operations, whatever the industry. Typically, there's some sort of threshold that below this threshold, it does not apply. And in this instance, we have that with FSMA. So specifically, when it was written that farms that have an average annual value of produce sold during the previous 3 years of $25,000 or less are not covered by FSMA. And so basically that means FSMA does not apply. Now there's a couple of things to note. One, that $25,000 in 2011 was written within the regulations to be adjusted for inflation. So for 2017, that 25,000 figure is actually $26,999 average for the 3 years of 2015 through 2017. So basically, you take your sales in 2015, 2016, 2017, as long as the three of those average under $26,999, you would not be covered by FSMA. So you would be essentially exempt from FSMA. The difficulty can happen is like, well, what if you're just a first-year farmer? Well, unfortunately, you don't get to add in zero. So if you're a first-year farmer and you plan to grow 10 acres of different produce, chances are you're going to be above that $25,000 threshold. So you'd have to operate with a forward-looking thought that you are going to be subject to FSMA. FSMA does allow for you to estimate whether you would or not in those sort of circumstances, or if you have less than 3 years of production data. Similarly, if you've been growing for a number of years, but you suddenly decide to enlarge your operation and you know your sales would be over, there would be the expectation that you actually do manage yourself as you would be covered. But again, this is for those smallest producers. There is the carve out that if you're under that $25,000 inflation adjusted figure, that you would be able to be exempt from FSMA. Now, let's say you're actually a little bit, well, and this is just a summary just to say again, we can say definitively and with emphasis, if your sales are lower than the $25,000 inflation adjusted figure, and again, that is all produce. So I will stress that $25,000 adjusted figure does include both covered and non-covered produce. So that's something that sometimes surprises people. So let's say you're growing tomatoes and winter squash being on the non-covered produce list, that would still, if the value of the winter squash plus tomatoes is greater than $25,000, would actually push you out of that category. Because again, it does take all produce, not just that which is covered by the regulations. That's how it's written, so that's how we have to apply it. So again, if you're below that $25,000 inflation adjusted figure for a 3-year average, you wouldn't be subject to FSMA. By the same token, just to reiterate, if it's going through processing step, is that where your crop's going, you'd be exempt from it. And if you only grow those produce commodities that are exempted, so if you were only growing winter squash and not growing something like tomatoes, then you would have the possibility of being exempt even if you were above $25,000 if you were only growing produce commodities that are exempt. So if you don't qualify for one of those 3 exemptions, what else? There's also what's referred to in the regulation as a qualified exemption. And this is a little bit more specific on who it covers. And the first eligibility part, and there's 2 parts to it, comes to sales. So like before, it's an inflation adjusted figure. So in 2011, it was written that the farm must have food sales averaging less than $500,000 per year during the previous 3 years. So again, that same 3-year period. And actually for 2017, that figure due to inflation was actually $539,982. What's also different from this determining factor and the prior one when it came to sales, again, that $25,000 figure only looked at all produce. This $500,000 figure looks at food sales, and those are 2 very different numbers. And the reason I say that is food includes livestock, meat, dairy products, milk. It includes livestock foods such as hay or grains that might be destined specifically for livestock. It can include wine or any other food for humans or animals. So that $500,000 figure is not just produce. It includes all food, including things such as hay, animal feed. I will stress that this is about sales, so it's not about the value of a herd of animals, or if you do hay or silage or grain for your own animals to eat. It's not the value of that. It does go back to gross sales. So it has to be a product or commodity that is sold before it can be counted in that $500,000 figure. But it is food and not produce. So that's important. So if you meet that, so if you're sales for the 3-year average of 2015 through 2017 is less than $539,982, there's still one more element that you have to meet. And that is the farm sales to qualified end users must exceed sales to all others during those 3 years. Okay, so 2 questions. One, what in the world is a qualified end user? Qualified end user is basically defined as the consumer of the food or a restaurant or retail establishment that is within the same state or Indian reservation, if you happen to have an operation on an Indian reservation, or not more than 275 miles away. So that would mean that where we're at in Southwest Virginia, if you are a farm, you would have the ability to count sales in some portions of Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina due to our proximity to all those states. So you would look at any sales that you're making, and basically what this is getting at, what a qualified end user is essentially saying is where the people that are going to be consuming or utilizing that food actually know where their product is coming from. And so this is, the consumer of the food would include locations such as farmers markets where you're dealing directly with a buyer, CSAs, an on-farm stand that you may operate. We would also want to include things such as if you have an agritourism destination, you would have to take into consideration agritourism food sales as well. And so all those come into play. And so what you do is you have to evaluate the amount of sales that are to a qualified end user versus those that are not. So essentially, the ones that are not qualified end users are more commercial in nature. These would be wholesalers and things of that nature where you're not selling directly to that end user. And so if greater than 50%, and it can be 50.001, it just has to be greater than 50% of gross sales, then you would be able to say that you are qualified exempt. Now, qualified exempt does still have some level of requirements associated with it. Primarily what we see is that you would be required to, at the point of purchase, prominently and conspicuously display the name and complete business address of the farm where the produce was grown on a label, poster, sign, placard, or other document delivered contemporaneously with the produce in the normal course of business, or in the case of internet sales, in an electronic notice. What this is basically telling us is that you have to have your farm readily identified. So the way I look at this, if you're selling direct to consumers, most of the time you want people to know who you are and where you're from. So just consider this to be part of your marketing program. Go ahead and integrate. Oftentimes you go to the farmer's market or other outlets, you will see where a farm has a sign with their name. You are specifically required to have the address of the farm as well, so start adding that to your marketing materials. When we're talking about other end users like restaurants or retail establishments like grocery stores, and I will say that that does include food service. So if you're selling directly to food service entities, that would also come into play. But typically you'll have this information on an invoice that you provide to them, so you're probably already meeting this requirement. And in the case that you have an electronic outlet such as internet sales, that's where you can just have a notice or again include it in the invoice processing so that it's clear to everyone. So again, this in and of itself is not that onerous, I believe. The other thing that you as a qualified exempt operation have to maintain is records that prove that your sales are meeting this exemption. And we'll talk in the resources about one resource that I think makes it easy for us because they have a good form for us to use to do that. And if you read through the actual regulation, they talk about how you're also subject to these other specific portions of the food safety or produce safety rule rather. But what we actually see with these is they're not standalone requirements. So like subpart A is just the general requirements that establishes what a qualified exemption is. Subpart O talks about records. But as a qualified exempt operation, you're limited on what you have to keep. And the same thing with subpart Q and R. those really don't create an additional burden. So if you are qualified exempt, there's very minimal additional work that you have to do other than one, establishing that you meet the requirement by having records related to your cells, and secondly, having your name and address of your farm prominently posted where you're actually having cells. If, however, you don't meet those two carve-outs, then you would have to complete or fall under the full requirements of the Produce Safety Rule. These are all the sections, and if you just kind of scan through them real quickly, you're going to see a lot of these line up with those same GAP section requirements, or at least close to it. So you see things such as personnel qualifications and training, health and hygiene, biological soil amendments, and things like that. Things that we already talked about were included in GAP are also included in FSMA. There is some commonality. One thing I will mention that is different between FSMA and GAP, FSMA does not require any sort of farm manual or written plan of an operation, but it does require records. Honestly, if there were a circumstance where a farm was not GAP certified, not going through that process, so they didn't have a farm plan, but they did have to meet FSMA, I would probably still highly encourage that farm to go ahead and create a manual, because to me, to make sure that you're doing the records at the frequency required and when required and specifically what you're having to cover, having a written plan makes a lot of sense. So I'd still encourage an operation to do that, even though, technically speaking, there's absolutely no requirement for any sort of plan or written manual in FSMA. One of the first steps you would want to take with FSMA is that you have to have a supervisor trained in the curriculum, which is in compliance with Rule 112.22c. There's actually only one curriculum that's currently recognized by FDA. That's actually the Produce Safety Alliance Grower Training, and we'll mention how you get to that later. So if you've not been through that class, if you're a covered farm, it is required, and I actually encourage all farms to go ahead and go through it. I think it gives you an idea of what you may look at in the future if you look at expansion. So I honestly encourage all farms to look at completing that class, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the resources. When we talk about what records are required if you are that covered farm, again, if you are exempted or if you're not covered, you got to have those records to support that. So you have to have records relating to your cells. Additionally, your personnel qualifications and training, that's subpart C. That's where you'd have records relating to the individual that does do that supervisor training, as well as training for your workers. Subpart E covers agricultural water. Right now, agricultural water is basically on hold. The initial parameters they came out with and testing requirements have been postponed. The earliest requirement for anybody that has to meet anything related to water is 2022. So it's still a couple of years away. And honestly, they don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So we could spend some time on what it looks like currently under the written regulations, but there's the full expectation that there's going to be modification to those. So instead, I'll just say that our current recommendation for farmers is to follow the water testing requirements of your specific GAP program. And as long as you're compliant with your GAP program, that would be sufficient for now with FSMA, but that is something that might change in the future. You'd also have records related to biological soil amendments of animal origin, which is basically to say manure and composted manures, and then as well as sanitation records relating to equipment, tools, and buildings, and more specifically, produce contact surfaces. And if we think about it, all those areas are basically addressed under GAP as well. So it kind of leads us to the question, does GAP certification satisfy FSMA regulations? Unfortunately, the basic answer is no. And part of that is there's not an exact mirroring of the requirements. So USDA harmonized GAP. They just this year, both USDA working in cooperation with FDA, updated and, as they say, aligned USDA's, and they stress voluntary, harmonized good agricultural practices audit program with the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. And one of the frequently asked questions they have, does this mean the requirements for the harmonized GAP audit and the Produce Safety Rule are identical? Short answer, no. While the requirements are not identical, the alignment does mean that technical components within the rule are covered in the harmonized GAP program and those metrics used by USDA to meet the rule's ultimate goals of increasing food safety. So basically it's similar. They're looking at the same things. The measurements are going to be similar, but it's not specifically guaranteeing you that your successful USDA harmonized GAP audit will satisfy the produce safety rule requirements. So unfortunately, we don't have that guarantee, but the good thing is those differences are fairly minor. So it's my belief that if you're currently doing GAP certification, or if you're planning to, you can make a few revisions to a GAP plan to make sure you're satisfying FSMA. And those revisions, one, won't run afoul of GAP. So there's nothing in FSMA that will cause you to fail GAP. And basically my goal is never ask a farmer to keep two sets of books or two sets of records. You don't need to have a GAP plan and a FSMA plan. Those should be integrated together to where you have one food safety plan. So taking a GAP plan that you may already have, tweaking it a little here and there to make sure that FSMA is satisfied will still allow you to pass that GAP certification. I will say, for instance, like with USDA harmonized GAP and water. Right now with FSMA, it's basically not looking at water, but GAP still does. So you would have to make sure that you still have those components of your GAP plan that may not be covered by a FSMA in there. But by taking that existing plan, I think you can save some work that way. I would say the same thing if operation is certified organic, and considering looking at GAP or FSMA, either one. Don't necessarily reinvent the wheel. You already are keeping a number of different records, and see how you can adjust those to meet the requirements of either standard, either GAP or FSMA, rather than creating something new and having to juggle more things. So again, one record can do multiple duty for any of these different programs. So a quick review between GAP and FSMA, and again, I'll encourage you, if you have any questions, move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, and you'll see the ability to open up a chat box or a Q&A box, and we'll take a look at those before we're done tonight. So with GAP certification or inspections, the purpose of that program is market access. And you're basically satisfying the requirement of a buyer who wants you to sell them their product. Your participation is completely voluntary. You each year go through that process. And when it comes to cost, it's widely varied for a number of different reasons. One is just the size of operations. Obviously an operation of 3 acres versus a 2,000 acre operation are going to be very different, just the amount of time an inspector has to spend there on site. But what we see mostly in our region, most operations are going to have a completed GAP inspection from anywhere a few hundred to several thousand. Most operations are under 1,000. It basically depends on which audit standard you're using and where that inspector has to come from. Because one of the primary costs associated with your inspection is travel costs for that inspector. So if you're using a standard that has regional inspectors located nearby, you'll see your costs be lowered. The other thing that can be useful to you is if you use the same company or entity that other farmers in your region are using, you can split those costs. So if an inspector is able to come to an area, maybe do 2, 3, 4 over a couple of day period, they're able then to reduce the individual costs to each farmer that way because they're able to split those travel costs. So if you know folks in your area that are looking at doing GAP or have done GAP, going with the same company can mean a reduced cost savings for everyone. If we contrast those elements with FSMA, first off, FSMA is regulatory, it's compliance. So it's not voluntary, it is mandatory, but depending on your specifics related to your operation, it may be limited what you have to do under FSMA. So again, not all crops, not all producers, but FSMA itself is mandatory. As for frequency of inspection, currently I'm unaware of any specified frequency within the FSMA regulations. 2018 was a year that was considered not to be an enforcement year. It was an education year for growers. We still have entities across the U.S. that are gearing up, figuring out how they're going to do these inspections. So like for the state of Virginia, I know that the Virginia Department of Ag and Consumer Services is going to be the inspector for FDA. In other states, it may be different. In some states, the state government entities are choosing not to be the inspectors. So it just depends on each individual state who may be that regulatory authority. And I can't find anywhere any specified frequency, but 2019 is anticipated being the first year that we're actually going to see enforcement inspections for farmers. 2018 has been a learning year for everyone, both farmers as well as inspectors. So you may have seen within the region various learning opportunities where they actually did on-farm visits with farmers with no consequences. They weren't through inspections, but they were walkthroughs with extension personnel, Department of Ag personnel, FDA folks. It was a way for everybody to become acquainted with what was required under FSMA. The good thing about FSMA is there's no direct cost to the farmers because it is regulatory in nature. It's not something that a farmer has to pay for. And because of that, it doesn't mean anything additional to your bottom line. So if you're already having to do GAP, you're not going to have to pay something additional to complete FSMA, because we know a lot of growers, when you start adding multiple costs for inspections onto them, it does have options to cause you to step out or find a way to avoid it. Luckily, with FSMA, there's no additional costs. So if it is that your operation falls under it, while you have to comply, it's not going to be directly a cost to you in inspections. So lastly, if we're talking about GAP certification, I just want to mention quickly some of the first steps you might be looking at taking. One, talk to your buyers. I mentioned it earlier. There's a lot of different GAP certification programs out there. And while any one may work, some buyers are very specific in what they want. So some may say USDA is not sufficient, we want a different company. And so make sure you understand what's required of you before you move forward. Once you select the GAP certifier, review the resources that they have available. Again, a number of those certifiers have templates or electronic programs that let you walk through creating a manual. There's numerous other resources out there from any number of different nonprofits, extension, and elsewhere that really are good. But again, with all of those resources, they have to be specifically adapted to your farm. So while you can take a template and run with it, they would want to make certain that they are looking at things that are specific to your farm. So never just take a template, fill it out, and don't worry about what's in it. Because basically when the inspector comes out to your farm for GAP, they evaluate your plan based on what you wrote. So if you wrote in your plan you're going to do something, they will hold it against you if you do not. Because again, GAP is about, do you have a plan and are you following it? So making sure that it's adapted specifically to your operation is essential. I'll mention there's several good resources in Kentucky for growers to take advantage of. Brian Brady, he works for the Food Connection at University of Kentucky. What he does as the Cultivate Kentucky Senior Associate is actually go out and work with Kentucky farmers creating their GAP manuals. So he'll help walk growers through that process. He's not going to write it for a grower. Growers have to be engaged in creating their own manual, but he does assist growers in that process so they can be prepared. And Josh Lindow, who is the produce marketing specialist at Kentucky Department of Agriculture, he actually works as a mock auditor. So he and Brian work together in that after Brian's completed his work with the grower, Josh will actually come out and do a walkthrough with the grower. And so basically farmers have the opportunity to have two sets of eyes on their operation before an auditor comes out. Before you're having to pay that money, both of those gentlemen come out and free of charge to growers. The other thing, both of them, every farmer that has completed those steps with those two gentlemen, they have all had a 100% success rate. So there's been no failures of GAP. Most growers, in my experience, whenever you work with them, once GAP is finished and they've passed it that first year, they almost universally say it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And so definitely it's something that you have to prepare for, and having resources such as this is hugely important. But farmers do have the capability of doing this, and I know it's been something I've seen, and I've enjoyed seeing farmers try it, have success, and then continue to have success. In Virginia, there's a number of different resources as well. Amber Valentin with the Virginia Cooperative Extension is one resource. She's actually the Fresh Produce Food Safety Team Coordinator, and we'll see her name again in a moment. I'm also available. We have that training program I mentioned earlier that works with farmers to help them develop a GAP manual, and that's something we do typically in a March-April timeframe, so we would be happy to have you participate in that class. If you aren't yet, please follow Appalachian Sustainable Development on Facebook. We'll have postings there about those training classes as they happen. Additionally, we will probably use the email addresses gained from these trainings to add to our notification list. If you happen to get a notification from us and don't want to be on the list, just shoot an email back and we will remove you. We don't want to spam anybody, but we do like to try to get our notices out as widely as possible. And I'll also mention your local extension office. I've worked with several different extension folks in Virginia and Kentucky, and there's some really well-trained, high-quality agents out there that know a lot about GAP. And so you may want to start at your extension office. Sometimes some agents are less familiar than others, but all of them should be able to point you to the good resources in each respective state. When it comes to FSMA, this was just issued in October. It's only a draft guidance. Excuse me while I take a drink. And a draft guidance means it's not the full final version. And so it is put out there for comment, so there could be some changes that do occur to it as time goes by. Can't remember when the exact comment period for this is wrapping up, but it will be shortly. But what this draft guidance essentially does is, in a more plainer language, establish what the expectations of FDA are for the various elements within the produce safety rule. So they have a number of different examples on like calculating your sales when we're talking about those not covered or qualified exempt operations. They have examples of those, so that helps you better understand what we're talking about with those numbers, as well as other clarity related to the regulation. Again, in one way I hesitate putting this up there because it's only draft currently, but I think this is going to be the primary source moving forward, especially once it's finalized. FDA does have a number of different documents on their website specifically related to FSMA and the produce safety rule specifically. And so just dig through those. So if you have a question in certain areas, again, I would just caution on the water area. Anything you read, just understand it's kind of had the pause button pushed on it, as those requirements are not now instituted, but there may be changes. So just understand with the water section specifically, it's not known exactly what's required, but you can review the current status so you understand what may be happening in the future. The first steps for FSMA, the biggest thing is figure out which category do you fall in. Are you the not covered smallest operations, that $25,000 inflation adjusted figure, or do you only grow produce that's not covered and therefore you're in that category? Are you qualified exempt based on your sales as well as greater than 50% being to that qualified end user? Or are you covered by it? Do you have to meet all the requirements? Figuring out which category you're in is important so you can meet whatever requirements you have to. You have to maintain records. Like I said, the minimum requirement you have to do, even if you're not covered, is you just have to show that you actually evaluated your sales and that, yes, you are under that threshold, or your only sales are related to not covered produce. What's really good is the Produce Safety Alliance, and I'll mention them again, actually has a document. You'll see the header of it there, records required by FSMA Produce Safety Rule. if you go to the Produce Safety Alliance, or if you type into any search engine records required by FSMA, this is almost always the first link that pops up. They are based out of Cornell, and they have a number of different resources, but I really like this one because they tell you what records are required under FSMA, and they give you record templates that you could use. Again, you could use any sort of template or form of records that meet the requirements, but I like that they have put together sample records that meet the full requirements of FSMA. So like FSMA has some requirements that it has to have the farm name on there, there has to be dating, there has to be a signature, and so on. And they have formatted record documents that do exactly that. So they completely align with those requirements. And so I think this is a great document for growers to take a look at. Doesn't mean you have to use those records. You can modify them, but it gives you an idea of what is required specifically under the FSMA regulations. Again, Produce Safety Alliance, what they have, going back to that supervisor training, the only recognized curriculum currently is the Produce Safety Alliance grower training. It is required for operations that would be covered, but I would highly encourage all operations to go ahead and take these trainings. The good thing is they have trainings happening all over the U.S. If you go to their website, you can see where upcoming trainings are happening. There's been funding resources through the FDA that has cut the cost to attend these trainings in some instances to zero. So you do want to pay attention to where the training is. Depending on where the money was coming from, sometimes that is limited to persons of a certain state. So for instance, Appalachian Harvest actually does some of these trainings. Our funding money is currently through a Virginia-specific fund, and because of that, if we have out-of-state folks attend the training, we do have to charge them for the training materials because we can't use those grant funds to pay for it. And so other states you will see they'll have cost, and they'll have two figures, one for in-state and one for out-of-state, and that's why they're in a similar situation. So you can find things regionally. If you want to have an excuse to go south for winter, you can definitely find some trainings happening down south. There's one occurring on the 27th, which is actually today. So I don't think you can make that one, but they do happen all over the U.S. And what's good about this is the way they're currently set up. If you take the training once, then you have been trained sufficiently moving forward. So it's not something where this is a training that you have to complete numerous times. So I encourage farmers, while they do have trainings out there that are at a reduced cost due to different funding pots, that you go ahead and take advantage of these. And again, if nothing else, this will let you better understand, even if you are in one of those not covered or qualified exempt categories, what could you be looking at if you were to expand your operation? Because I think you need to have that understanding before you start making business decisions like that. And again, while FSMA itself is not that onerous, there are some specific things that you do have to look at. So in Kentucky, if we're looking for some additional resources, at the University of Kentucky Food Systems Innovation Center, Dr. Paul Vijay-Kumar is their point person for FSMA. You can see his contact information on your screen. Additionally, at the Kentucky Department of Ag, they recently hired Ben Connor as the Produce Safety Supervisor. Both of those gentlemen can be persons that you ask questions of. Paul has had a number of different PSA grower trainings in the U.S. I'm sure he'll be scheduling additional ones in the future. So both of those would be a resource to you. And of course, local extension offices, again, a good source of information. They generally are aware of those trainings and when they'll be happening. In Virginia, again, we see Amber Valentin with Virginia Cooperative Extension and her contact information. She is the point person for the Fresh Produce Safety Team and for the FSMA trainings within Virginia. I also mentioned that in Virginia specifically, VDACS, or Virginia Department of Ag and Consumer Services, is the regulator that will be looking at FSMA compliance. They have a really good website, including an interactive tool that you can walk through that actually does help decide which category you're in. So it's more than just a decision tree. I know FDA has some of those out there. The good thing about this is interactive and helps you walk through. And so it is a possibility for growers in other states to use it because, again, this is a federal program and the basic exemptions are the same from state to state without any differences. But if you're in Virginia and you have some questions, there's their contact information. You may want to take advantage of that. And again, local extension office has a lot of good information for you as well.